A desperate widow with 2 hungry children answered a rancher's call for a wife, only to be cast aside like yesterday's trash when he saw her unwanted baggage. But sometimes the heart that's been broken the most is the one capable of the greatest love. And sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected place of all. The dust swirled through Mesquite Flats like the whispered prayers of the desperate, carrying with it the scent of sage and broken dreams. It was the kind of town where hope came to die slowly, where the sun beat down mercilessly on wooden storefronts that had seen better decades, and where the only sounds that mattered were the creak of wagon wheels and the distant lowing of cattle that represented someone else's prosperity.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
On this particular Tuesday morning in September of 1878, as the church bell chimed 10 times across the weathered landscape, a stagecoach rolled to a stop in front of Murphy's General Store, and with it came a woman whose story would split this town right down the middle. Magnolia Maggie Sinclair stepped down from that dusty coach with the kind of dignity that poverty couldn't quite steal. Her calico dress mended so many times it told the story of her struggles in every careful stitch. She was 26 years old, but carried herself with the weight of someone who had seen too much too young. Her auburn hair pinned back severely beneath a worn black bonnet that spoke of mourning not yet finished. In her arms she cradled a sleeping baby girl no more than 8 months old, while a boy of perhaps 4 years clung to her skirts with eyes that had learned caution far too early. The child's clothes were clean but patched, his shoes held together with hope and determination, and when he looked up at the gathering crowd of onlookers, there was something in his gaze that suggested he had already learned not to expect kindness from strangers. Maggie's own eyes swept across the faces of the townspeople, who had emerged from their daily routines to witness this arrival, searching for one face in particular, the face she had memorized from a tintype photograph that now rested in the bottom of her carpetbag. She was looking for Harrison Caldwell, the cattle rancher who had placed an advertisement in the Denver Post 3 months prior, seeking a God-fearing woman of good character for marriage and homemaking, loneliness no obstacle to right match. She had answered that advertisement with a letter that told the truth about her circumstances, about her husband's death in a mining accident, about her 2 children who needed a father's guidance, about her willingness to work hard and build a life with a good man who understood that love sometimes came with responsibilities already attached. The correspondence that followed had filled her with something she had almost forgotten how to feel. Harrison Caldwell wrote of his ranch, of his cattle, of Sunday mornings that felt too quiet and evenings that stretched too long without the sound of a woman's laughter or children's voices. He wrote that he had always wanted a family but had been too busy building his fortune to find the right woman, and now at 35, he realized that all the success in the world meant nothing without someone to share it with. Most importantly, he had written that he welcomed the prospect of ready-made children, that he saw them not as burdens, but as blessings that would bring immediate joy to his lonely home. Those letters had sustained Maggie through the long journey from Denver, through the sale of her few remaining possessions to afford the stagecoach fare, through the nights when little Sarah cried from hunger and young Thomas asked when they would finally have enough food again. She had read Harrison's words so many times that she could recite them from memory, especially the passage where he wrote, "A woman who has known love and loss, who has children to prove her capacity for devotion, is exactly the kind of partner I have been praying for. Bring them to me, Magnolia, and let us build something beautiful together." But as Maggie stood in the dusty street of Mesquite Flats, her heart began to sink like a stone dropped into a deep well. The man approaching her bore little resemblance to the confident, welcoming rancher she had imagined from his letters. Harrison Caldwell was indeed tall and broad-shouldered, with the weathered hands of a man who worked cattle for a living, but his face wore an expression of barely concealed horror as his eyes traveled from her face to the children at her side. His jaw was set in a hard line, his blue eyes cold as winter morning frost, and when he stopped 3 feet away from her, he made no move to extend his hand in greeting or offer any gesture of welcome. "You're the Sinclair woman," he said, and it wasn't a question. His voice carried the kind of disappointment that cut deeper than anger, the tone of a man who felt he had been deceived in the worst possible way. Around them, the townspeople had begun to gather in earnest, drawn by the obvious tension crackling between the rancher and the travel-worn woman with her children. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house stepped closer, her arms folded across her ample chest, while old Pete from the livery stable leaned against a hitching post, chewing tobacco and watching the scene unfold with the interested air of a man who lived for such drama. "I am Magnolia Sinclair," Maggie replied, lifting her chin despite the growing knot of dread in her stomach. "And these are my children, Thomas and Sarah. You wrote that you were eager to meet us, that you had been praying for exactly such a family." She shifted the baby to one arm and reached into her carpetbag with her free hand, pulling out the bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. "You wrote that children would bring joy to your home, that you saw them as blessings rather than burdens." Harrison's face darkened like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. "That was before I knew what I was getting myself into," he said, his voice rising enough that the growing crowd could hear every word. "You told me you had children, yes, but you made it sound like maybe one older child, someone who could help around the ranch, not a baby that needs constant attention, and a boy who's barely out of diapers himself." His eyes swept over little Thomas, who had pressed himself against his mother's skirts at the harshness in the stranger's voice, and baby Sarah, who had begun to fuss in Maggie's arms. "I'm a working man, Mrs. Sinclair. I need a wife who can pull her weight, not someone who's going to be tied down with squalling infants and a child who'll need watching every minute of the day." The words hit Maggie like physical blows, each one designed to wound and humiliate. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from the injustice of it all. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling. In her hands, "I was completely honest in my letters about my circumstances. I told you exactly how old my children were. I told you about their needs, and you responded by saying that a woman who had proven her capacity for love and devotion was exactly what you wanted. You said that ready-made children would save you. Years of waiting for a family. That was when I thought you might be bringing me a 12-year-old who could help with chores and maybe a younger sibling." Harrison shot back, his voice now loud enough that people were starting to emerge from buildings up and down the street. "Not a crying baby and a little boy who looks like he might blow away in a strong wind. Do you have any idea how much it costs to feed and clothe children? Do you know how much work it takes to raise them properly? I'm running a cattle ranch, not a foundling home for other men's mistakes." The cruel words hung in the air like gun smoke, and around them, Maggie could hear the sharp intake of breath from several women in the crowd. Mrs. Henderson made a soft sound of disapproval, but when Maggie looked around desperately for a friendly face, she found only curious stares and barely concealed pity. Thomas began to cry quietly, overwhelmed by the hostility radiating from the man who was supposed to welcome them, and the sound seemed to galvanize Harrison's resolve. "I'm sorry you came all this way," he continued, though his tone suggested he felt nothing resembling sorrow, "but this arrangement isn't going to work. I need a wife, not a ready-made family with all the expenses and complications that come with it. I suggest you get back on that stagecoach and find yourself a widower. Somewhere who actually wants other men's children, because I certainly don't." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Thomas's quiet sobbing and the distant mooing of cattle from somewhere beyond the town limits. Maggie stood frozen in the center of that hostile circle, her baby growing heavier. In her arms, her 4-year-old son clinging to her skirts, and her future crumbling around her like a house built on sand. She had spent her last $5 on this journey, had sold everything she owned to get here, had burned every bridge behind her in Denver, because Harrison Caldwell had promised her a new life, a fresh start, a chance for her children to grow up with a father's guidance and protection. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the still air, "I have no money for return passage. I sold everything I owned to come here because you assured me that my children would be welcome in your home."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
"You wrote to me for 3 months, convincing me that this was God's plan for all of us. You can't simply change your mind now and leave us stranded." Harrison's expression hardened further, if such a thing were possible. "I can do whatever I please, Mrs. Sinclair. This is my town, my land, my decision. You misrepresented yourself in those letters, made yourself sound like exactly what I needed, when clearly you're exactly what I don't want. A man has a right to inspect the goods before he commits to purchase, and what I see here isn't what was advertised." The comparison of her and her children to livestock stung worse than any physical slap could have. Around them, the crowd had grown larger, drawn by the public spectacle of a woman being humiliated in the town square. She could see the faces now, some merely curious, others openly disapproving, and a few showing the kind of cruel satisfaction that came from watching someone else's misfortune. Mrs. Patterson from the dress shop whispered something to her neighbor. That made both women laugh softly, while several of the men nodded approvingly at Harrison's harsh words, as if they agreed that he was well within his rights to reject damaged goods. "Please," Maggie said, and hated herself for the pleading note that crept into her voice. "If you won't honor your commitment to marry me, at least let me work for you to earn passage money. I can cook, clean, mend clothes, help with the household duties. My children won't be any trouble, I promise. Thomas is very well behaved, and Sarah is a good baby who sleeps through the night most times. Just give us a chance to prove ourselves." But Harrison was already shaking his head before she finished speaking. "I don't need a housekeeper with children attached, Mrs. Sinclair. I need a wife, a partner, someone who can focus entirely on making my life easier, not someone who's going to be distracted by crying babies and demanding children. Besides," he added with a cruel smile, "what kind of example would I be setting, taking in a woman and her bastard children? People around here have standards." The word bastard landed like a thunderclap, and Thomas's quiet crying turned into heartbroken sobs. Maggie felt something cold and hard settle in her chest, a protective fury that burned away the last of her desperate pleading. "My children are not bastards, Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice now clear and strong despite the tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. "They are legitimate children born in holy matrimony to their father and me. Their father died in a mining accident trying to provide for his family, and that makes them orphans, not bastards. The only thing illegitimate here is your behavior and your complete lack of honor." Harrison's face flushed red at the public rebuke, and his voice rose to a shout that echoed off the buildings surrounding the square. "Don't you lecture me about honor, woman. You're the one who came here under false pretenses, trying to trick me into taking on responsibilities I never agreed to. You're nothing but a con artist in widow's weeds, looking for a man fool enough to pay for raising another man's spawn." The crowd was murmuring now, some voices raised in agreement with Harrison's harsh assessment, others expressing shock at his cruelty toward a woman with small children. Maggie could see the battle lines being drawn in the faces around her, could feel the weight of their judgment settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She was trapped in the center of a nightmare, publicly humiliated with nowhere to go and no resources to escape. It was then, in that moment of absolute despair, that she heard the sound that would change everything. The steady rhythm of hoofbeats on hard-packed earth, moving with the controlled pace of a rider who was in no hurry but had a destination firmly in mind. The crowd began to turn, their attention diverted from the drama in the square to the lone horseman approaching from the direction of the hills beyond town. Even Harrison's tirade faltered as he followed the gaze of the onlookers, his eyes narrowing as he tried to identify the newcomer. The man who rode into Mesquite Flats that afternoon sat his horse like he had been born to it, his posture straight and confident, his hands steady on the reins. He was tall, even-mounted, with the broad shoulders and lean build of someone accustomed to physical labor, but it was his face that drew immediate attention and whispered commentary from the crowd. His features carried the strong bones and bronze skin that marked him unmistakably as Indian, though his clothing was a mixture of traditional and white man's garb, leather leggings and vest worn with a cotton shirt and a hat that had seen better days. His dark hair was long, braided with strips of leather and small silver ornaments that caught the afternoon sun, and when his eyes swept across the gathered townspeople, they held the kind of calm intelligence that suggested he missed very little of what went on around him. This was Swift Bear, though the white residents of Mesquite Flats knew him simply as the half-breed who lived in the hills and occasionally came to town to trade furs and crafted goods for supplies he couldn't make or find for himself. He was Comanche by birth, but had lived apart from both his mother's people and his father's world for most of his 32 years, carving out a solitary existence that required him to navigate carefully between two cultures that often viewed him with suspicion. He spoke perfect English when he chose to, had learned to read from a missionary's wife during a brief stint at a government school, and possessed skills in tracking, hunting, and survival that made him invaluable to the occasional traveler or lawman who needed his expertise. Swift Bear had not come to town for supplies this day. He had been riding the high trails above Mesquite Flats when the sound of raised voices carried up from the valley below, and something in the tone of those voices, something angry and cruel, had drawn him closer to investigate. From his vantage point on the ridge, he had watched the scene unfold in the town square, had seen the woman with her children being publicly humiliated by the rancher, had witnessed the crowd's mixture of entertainment and condemnation. What he saw stirred something in him that he had thought long buried, a protective instinct that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the recognition of unnecessary suffering. As he guided his horse closer to the crowd, Swift Bear's keen eyes took in every detail of the tableau before him. The woman stood with her spine straight, despite the obvious distress in her face, holding her baby with practiced care while her young son pressed against her skirts. Her clothes were worn but clean, her posture dignified despite the circumstances, and there was something in her bearing that spoke of strength held in careful reserve. The man confronting her was red-faced with anger and self-righteousness, his voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to having his word accepted as law. Around them, the townspeople watched with the avid interest of spectators at a particularly entertaining show, their faces reflecting varying degrees of amusement, disapproval, and satisfied superiority. Swift Bear had seen scenes like this before, had been the target of similar public scorn himself on more than one occasion. He knew the particular kind of cruelty that came from a crowd united in their condemnation of someone they perceived as different, unwanted, or somehow deserving of their disdain. He also knew that such moments revealed more about the character of the crowd than about the character of their victim, and what he saw in the faces around that woman and her children filled him with a cold disgust that he kept carefully hidden. Behind an impassive expression, the murmuring of the crowd grew louder as Swift Bear dismounted and approached the edge of the circle, his presence adding a new element of tension to an already volatile situation. Several people stepped back instinctively, their discomfort with his proximity obvious in their body language, while others craned their necks to get a better look at the unexpected addition to their entertainment. Harrison Caldwell's eyes fixed on the approaching Indian with immediate suspicion and hostility, his hand moving unconsciously toward the gun at his hip. "This doesn't concern you, Breed," Harrison called out, his voice carrying a warning that was meant to be heard by everyone. present. This is white folks' business, and you'd best keep moving along before there's trouble. Swift Bear stopped at the edge of the crowd, but made no move to retreat. His dark eyes moved slowly from Harrison's flushed face to the woman and children. At the center of the confrontation, taking in details that others had missed or chosen to ignore, he saw the careful mending in the woman's dress that spoke of pride maintained despite poverty, saw the way she held herself protectively over her children without cowering, saw the exhaustion and desperation she was trying so hard to hide the mask of dignity. In her face, he recognized something he had seen in his own mirror too many times, the look of someone who had been pushed to the very edge of their endurance, but refused to break. "Trouble," Swift Bear said quietly, his voice carrying clearly, despite its low tone, seems to have already arrived. His English was precise, educated, carrying no trace of the broken grammar that many whites expected from an Indian, though it appears to be wearing different clothes than usual. The words sent a ripple of tension through the crowd, and Harrison's face darkened further. "You got something you want to say, you say it plain and move along. Otherwise, keep your opinions to yourself and get out of our town." Swift Bear's expression remained calm, almost thoughtful, as his gaze returned to the woman and her children. "I was merely observing," he said, "that a man who would publicly humiliate a woman with small children might want to consider what such behavior says about his own character and what kind of man the good people of this town choose to support." The challenge was subtle but unmistakable, and the effect on the crowd was immediate. Some faces flushed with anger at the implied criticism, while others looked uncomfortable, perhaps seeing their own behavior reflected in Swift Bear's quietly spoken words. Harrison's hand moved closer to his gun, but he was aware that drawing on an unarmed man in front of witnesses would require justification he didn't currently have. "That woman came here under false pretenses," Harrison said loudly, playing to the crowd rather than addressing Swift Bear directly. "She tried to trick me into taking on responsibilities I never agreed to, bringing children I never said I wanted. A man has a right to refuse what he doesn't want without being lectured by some half-breed drifter who doesn't understand the first thing about civilized society." Swift Bear nodded slowly, as if considering this argument with genuine thoughtfulness. "Indeed," he said, "a man certainly has the right to refuse what he doesn't want, just as a woman has the right to expect a man to honor his word once given, and children have the right to be treated with basic human decency regardless of their circumstances." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "I wonder, which of these rights takes precedence in what you call civilized society?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, and Maggie found herself staring at this unexpected defender with a mixture of gratitude and amazement. No one else in the crowd had spoken up for her. No one else had challenged Harrison's right to humiliate her publicly. But this stranger, this man who was clearly viewed with suspicion and hostility by the townspeople, had stepped forward when no one else would. She watched as Harrison's face cycled through several shades of red, clearly struggling to find a response that would maintain his position of authority, while dealing with an opponent who refused to be intimidated. "What I do with my own affairs is none of your concern," Harrison finally managed, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "This woman and her brats aren't your problem, and they sure as hell aren't going to be mine. If you're so concerned about them, you're welcome to take them off our hands. Otherwise, mind your own business and let us mind ours." It was meant as a dismissal, a way to end the conversation and send the Indian on his way. But Swift Bear surprised everyone by considering the suggestion seriously. His eyes moved once more to Maggie and her children, taking in the quiet desperation in her face, the way little Thomas had stopped crying but remained pressed against his mother's skirts, the peaceful way baby Sarah slept despite the chaos around her. Something stirred in his chest, something he hadn't felt in longer than he could remember, a sense of rightness that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with instinct. Perhaps, Swift Bear said quietly, that would be the best solution for everyone involved. The words sent a shock through the crowd that was almost audible, and Maggie felt her knees go weak with a combination of relief and terror. Relief that anyone was offering her an alternative to being stranded in a hostile town with no resources and nowhere to go. Terror because she knew nothing about this man, except that he was willing to stand up to a crowd when no one else would. And because accepting help from him would mean placing herself and her children completely at the mercy of a stranger who owed them nothing and had no reason to be kind. But as she looked into Swift Bear's calm, intelligent eyes, she saw something there that she had stopped expecting to see in anyone's face. She saw genuine concern, not pity or condescension, but the kind of respect that recognized her as a person deserving of basic human dignity. And in that moment, with her baby growing heavy in her arms and her son clinging to her skirts, surrounded by a crowd that viewed her as nothing more than entertainment, she made a decision that would change the course of her life forever. "I would be grateful," she said, her voice clear despite the trembling in her hands, "for any assistance you might be willing to offer." The die was cast, the words spoken that could not be taken back. Around them, the crowd erupted in shocked murmurs and scandalized whispers, while Harrison's face went from red to purple with outrage. But Swift Bear simply nodded once, as if her acceptance of his offer was no more remarkable than accepting an invitation to dinner, and moved forward to take her carpetbag from her trembling hands, and thus began a story that would challenge everything. The people of Mesquite Flats thought they knew about civilization, family, and the true meaning of home. The silence that followed Maggie's acceptance stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Swift Bear moved through the crowd with the fluid grace of a predator, his moccasined feet making no sound on the hard-packed earth as he approached the small family that had just become his responsibility. The townspeople parted before him reluctantly, their faces reflecting a mixture of fascination and revulsion, as if they were watching a dangerous animal that might turn on them without warning. When he reached Maggie's side, he extended his hand toward her carpetbag, with a gesture so natural and courteous that it seemed to mock the crude behavior she had just endured. "May I?" he asked, and there was something in his tone that transformed the simple question into a gesture of respect rather than presumption. Maggie nodded, unable to trust her voice, and watched as he lifted her few possessions with the same care he might have shown handling precious artifacts. His movements were economical, purposeful, suggesting a man accustomed to taking action rather than wasting time on unnecessary words or gestures. When he turned to face the crowd again, his expression remained perfectly neutral, but there was something in his posture that suggested he was fully aware of the undercurrents of hostility swirling around them. "Mrs. Sinclair," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the square, "my camp is a few miles north of here. If you and your children are ready to travel, we should leave while there's still good daylight." He glanced at little Thomas, who had stopped crying but remained pressed against his mother's skirts, his wide eyes fixed on this stranger who spoke with such calm authority. "The boy can ride with me if he's tired from the journey. The trail isn't difficult, but it requires attention." Harrison Caldwell's face had progressed through several shades of outrage and was now settling into a purple that suggested apoplexy might be imminent. "Now you wait just a minute," he sputtered, stepping forward as if he intended to physically intervene. "You can't just walk into my town and steal away a woman who came here to marry me. There are laws about such things, legal contracts and obligations that need to be honored." Swift Bear turned his calm gaze on the rancher, and for a moment, the air between them seemed to crackle with tension. "Your concern for legal obligations is touching, Mr. Caldwell," he said with such perfect politeness that the sarcasm barely registered, though it seems to have arrived somewhat late in the proceedings. "I wasn't aware that publicly humiliating a woman and her children constituted a binding legal contract in the eyes of either white man's law or common human decency." The crowd stirred uneasily at this exchange, sensing that they were witnessing something more significant than a simple disagreement over a failed marriage arrangement. Several of the men had moved closer to Harrison's side, their hands resting casually near their weapons, while the women whispered among themselves with the excited energy of people who sensed violence brewing. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house pushed forward through the crowd, her face flushed with indignation and moral certainty. "You can't seriously be considering this, Mrs. Sinclair," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having her opinions treated as gospel truth. "Going off with a savage you don't know from Adam, taking your innocent children into God knows what kind of situation. Have you lost your Christian mind entirely? What kind of mother puts her children in such danger?" The words hit Maggie like physical blows, each one designed to strip away what little confidence she had left. She could feel the weight of the crowd's judgment pressing down on her, could see the mixture of shock and disapproval in their faces as they contemplated the scandal of a white woman voluntarily placing herself under the protection of an Indian. For a moment, doubt crept into her mind like poison, whispering that perhaps they were right. Perhaps she was making a terrible mistake that would endanger her children's lives and souls. But then she looked at Swift Bear's face and saw something there that steadied her resolve. His expression remained calm, but his eyes held a kind of patient understanding that suggested he was familiar with such accusations and had long ago learned not to let them wound him. There was no anger in his face, no defensive posturing or heated denials, just the quiet dignity of a man who knew his own worth and felt no need to justify it to others. In that moment, Maggie realized that this stranger had shown her more respect in the last 10 minutes than Harrison Caldwell had shown in 3 months of correspondence. "Mrs. Henderson," Maggie said, her voice growing stronger with each word, "I appreciate your concern for my children's welfare. But it seems to me that the greatest danger they face right now is being stranded in a town where their mother has been publicly branded as a liar and a con artist, with no money, no prospects, and no hope of improving their situation. At least this gentleman has offered us assistance without demanding payment or humiliation in return." Swift Bear nodded approvingly at her response, then addressed the crowd in general. "For those who are concerned about the welfare of these children," he said, his voice carrying across the square with the authority of a man accustomed to being heard, "I invite you to consider what alternatives you are offering. Mrs. Sinclair has no money for return passage, no relatives to take her in, no employment prospects in a town where she has been publicly disgraced. Are any of you prepared to provide her with honest work, decent lodging, and the means to support her family? Or are you content to stand here passing judgment while offering nothing constructive in return?" The challenge was delivered so quietly, so reasonably, that it took several moments for its full impact to register. When it did, the crowd shifted uncomfortably, faces flushing with embarrassment as people realized they were being called to account for their lack of Christian charity. A few voices started to rise in defensive explanation, but Swift Bear continued before they could gain momentum. "I thought not," he said, not unkindly but with the finality of a man stating an obvious truth. "In that case, perhaps you might consider allowing this woman to make her own decisions about her family's welfare, since she is the only one among you who seems genuinely concerned with their actual survival rather than your own moral superiority." The words sent a shock wave through the gathering that was almost visible. Several of the women gasped audibly at the rebuke, while the men bristled with anger at being lectured by someone they considered inferior. Harrison's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but he was restrained by the awareness that Swift Bear had not actually threatened anyone or violated any law that would justify violence. The Indian had simply held up a mirror to their behavior, and the reflection was not flattering. "You got a smart mouth for a breed," growled Pete from the livery stable, spitting tobacco juice dangerously close to Swift Bear's feet. Maybe someone ought to teach you some manners about how to talk to your betters." Swift Bear's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle adjustment that transformed him from a man making conversation into a warrior assessing potential threats. "I learned my manners from the same teachers who instructed me in reading, writing, and arithmetic," he replied calmly. "Missionary schools have very particular ideas about proper behavior. Perhaps you would like to compare our educations?" The offer was made with such perfect politeness that it took Pete several seconds to realize he was being mocked. When he did, his face darkened with rage, and he took a step forward with his fists clenched. But before the confrontation could escalate, Sheriff Morrison emerged from his office across the square. Drawn by the sound of raised voices and the knowledge that large crowds in his town usually meant trouble was brewing, Morrison was a pragmatic man in his 50s, who had learned to navigate the complex racial tensions of frontier life by focusing on keeping the peace rather than enforcing moral codes. He knew Swift Bear by reputation, if not personally, knew him as a man who caused no trouble, paid for his supplies in good currency, and occasionally provided valuable tracking services to the law. He also knew that the half-breed was perfectly capable of defending himself against multiple attackers if the situation deteriorated, and Morrison had no desire to deal with the paperwork and political complications that would result from violence. In his town square, "What's all the commotion about?" Morrison asked, though his tone suggested he already had a good idea of the situation. "Mrs. Sinclair, I understand you had some difficulties with your marriage arrangement." "I'm sorry to hear that, but these things happen sometimes. People don't always turn out to be what they seem in letters." Maggie felt a flash of anger at the sheriff's casual dismissal of her humiliation, but before she could respond, Swift Bear spoke up. "Sheriff Morrison, Mrs. Sinclair and her children are in need of assistance. Since no one else in your town seems inclined to provide it, I have offered them shelter and protection until they can determine their next course of action. I trust this meets with your approval." Morrison studied the Indian's face carefully, looking for signs of sarcasm or challenge, but found only respectful inquiry. "That's mighty generous of you, Swift Bear," he said finally. "Though I hope you understand the kind of talk this is going to generate. People around here have strong feelings about such arrangements. I am aware of local customs and prejudices." Swift Bear replied, "However, I was under the impression that Christian charity was also a local custom, and it seems to be in rather short supply today. Perhaps my offer will inspire others to examine their own consciences." Sheriff Morrison suppressed what might have been a smile at the gentle rebuke. "I'm sure it will give folks plenty to think about," he said diplomatically. "Mrs. Sinclair, you're free to make your own choices about your family's welfare. This is a free country, after all. Just make sure you know what you're getting into." The sheriff's words carried the weight of official sanction, effectively ending any legal objections to Swift Bear's offer. Harrison's face went through several more color changes as he realized that his authority in the situation had evaporated. While the crowd began to disperse, their entertainment value exhausted now that violence seemed unlikely. But the whispers followed Maggie as Swift Bear helped her gather her few possessions. Comments about white women who forgot their place, and children who would be raised as savages, that were meant to be overheard and to wound. Thomas had been watching these proceedings with the wide-eyed intensity of a child trying to understand adult conflicts that made no sense to him. When Swift Bear knelt down to his level, the boy instinctively shrank back against his mother's skirts, but something in the man's patient expression seemed to reassure him. Swift Bear made no attempt to touch the child or force conversation, simply waited until curiosity overcame fear. "Your name is Thomas?" Swift Bear asked quietly, his voice gentle enough not to startle the boy. When Thomas nodded shyly, Swift Bear smiled, and the expression transformed his stern features into something almost boyish. "That's a strong name. My horse is called Windrunner, and he's been looking forward to meeting someone brave enough to ride with him. Would you like to see him? The mention of a horse brought a spark of interest to Thomas's eyes, though he remained pressed against his mother's side. Maggie felt her heart clench at the sight of her son's cautious hope, remembering how he had once been fearless and trusting before life taught him to expect disappointment from adults. She nodded encouragingly, and Thomas took a tentative step toward the stranger who had offered them sanctuary. Swift Bear led them toward his horse with the unhurried pace of a man who understood that trust could not be rushed. Windrunner was a magnificent paint gelding, black and white patches flowing across his coat like storm clouds against snow, with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to assess each member of the small party with careful attention. The horse stood perfectly still as Swift Bear approached, showing the kind of training that spoke of years of partnership rather than mere domestication. "He's beautiful," Maggie breathed, and meant it. She had grown up around horses before her marriage, had learned to ride almost before she could walk, but she had never seen an animal that moved with such grace and obvious intelligence. Windrunner turned his head toward her as if responding to the compliment, and she found herself smiling for the first time since arriving in Mesquite Flats. "He has good judgment about people," Swift Bear said, watching as the horse lowered his head to inspect Thomas with gentle curiosity. "And he especially likes children. He was raised with my cousin's little ones, learned early that small humans require extra care." He gestured toward a leather parfleche bag secured behind the saddle. "I have blankets there and food for the journey. It's not far to my camp, but the trail can be rough for those not used to mountain travel." As they prepared to leave, Swift Bear's movements were economical and efficient, but Maggie noticed how he consistently positioned himself between her family and the hostile stares of the townspeople. It was subtle, protective without being possessive. The behavior of a man accustomed to reading danger in human faces and responding accordingly. When he helped her mount behind the saddle, his touch was respectful, impersonal, offering support without presumption. Thomas was lifted up to sit in front of Swift Bear, his small hands gripping the saddle horn with white-knuckled determination. But as they began to move, his fear gradually gave way to wonder at the horse's smooth gait and the elevated view of the world from horseback. Swift Bear kept up a quiet commentary about the landmarks they passed, his voice pitched to entertain a child while providing Maggie with information about their destination. "That ridge there marks the beginning of the high country," he said, pointing toward a line of hills that rose like sleeping giants against the afternoon sky. "The water runs cleaner up there, and the air is thin enough to make you dizzy if you're not used to it. But it's peaceful, quiet enough to hear yourself think." He glanced back at Maggie, who was holding baby Sarah securely against her chest. "How is the little one traveling?" "She's fine," Maggie replied, though her voice carried the exhaustion that came from too many sleepless nights and too much worry. "Sarah is a good traveler. She slept through most of the stagecoach journey, though I think she's getting hungry again." She hesitated, then added, "I want to thank you for what you did back there. No one else was willing to help us." Swift Bear was quiet for a moment, his attention apparently focused on guiding Windrunner along a particularly rocky stretch of trail. When he spoke, his voice carried no trace of the anger that would have been justified after the scene in town. "Kindness should not be remarkable," he said simply. "The fact that it is says more about the world we live in than about any individual's character." The trail began to climb more steeply as they left the valley floor behind, winding through stands of pine and aspen that whispered secrets in the afternoon breeze. The air grew cooler and cleaner, carrying the scent of pine needles and mountain flowers, a sharp contrast to the dust and heat of the town below. Thomas had relaxed enough to point out interesting rocks and birds along the way, his natural curiosity beginning to overcome his recent traumatic experiences. "What's that bird?" he asked, pointing to a flash of blue that darted between the trees. Swift Bear followed his gaze with the patient attention of a teacher who understood that Knowledge shared was knowledge multiplied. That's a Steller's jay, Swift Bear explained. They're clever birds, good at finding food and even better at stealing it from campers who don't secure their supplies properly. My people consider them messengers, though whether they bring good news or bad depends on how you interpret their calls. Maggie found herself listening to this exchange with growing amazement. In less than an hour, this stranger had shown more genuine interest in her son's questions and natural curiosity than Harrison Caldwell had demonstrated in 3 months of correspondence. There was something in Swift Bear's manner with Thomas that spoke of experience with children, a natural understanding of how to engage a young mind without overwhelming it. "You have children of your own?" she asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. She had no right to pry into his private life, especially when he was helping them at considerable inconvenience and potential cost to himself. "No," Swift Bear replied, and there was something in his tone that discouraged further inquiry into that particular subject. "But I have been uncle to many, and children have always been welcome in my camp. They see the world differently than adults, notice things we miss, ask questions that reveal truths we've forgotten how to see." The conversation lapsed into comfortable silence as they continued climbing, each lost in their own thoughts. Maggie found herself studying her rescuer's profile, trying to understand what would motivate a man to take on the responsibility of a woman and 2 children he had never seen before today. His face was strong, weathered by sun and wind, with the kind of lines around his eyes that suggested he spent most of his time outdoors. There was something about his bearing that spoke of education and intelligence, but also of experiences that had taught him hard lessons about the world and his place in it. As the afternoon wore on, the landscape around them changed dramatically. The dusty browns and yellows of the valley gave way to the deep greens of mountain forests, and the air carried the sound of running water that grew stronger as they climbed. When they finally crested a ridge and looked down into a hidden valley, Maggie gasped at the beauty spread out before them. Swift Bear's camp was situated beside a clear mountain stream, in a meadow surrounded by towering pines that provided natural windbreaks and privacy. A traditional tipi stood near the water's edge, its painted designs faded but still visible, while a more modern cabin of logs and chinked stone occupied higher ground where it would stay dry during spring floods. Corrals made of split rails contained several horses, and gardens laid out in neat rows showed evidence of careful cultivation and attention. "It's beautiful," Maggie said, and the words came out as little more than a whisper. After the hostility and ugliness of the town, this hidden sanctuary seemed like something from a dream, too perfect to be real. The setting sun painted the meadow in shades of gold and amber, while the sound of the stream provided a peaceful counterpoint to the evening song of birds settling in for the night. Swift Bear smiled at her reaction, the expression genuine and unguarded for the first time since she had met him. "I've been building this place for almost 10 years, he said, pride evident in his voice. "It's far enough from town to discourage casual visitors, but close enough to civilization to trade for what I can't make or grow myself. The water is sweet, the hunting is good, and the winters are hard enough to keep away anyone who isn't serious about staying." As they approached the cabin, Maggie could see evidence of Swift Bear's skill and craftsmanship in every detail. The logs were perfectly fitted, the chinking solid and weatherproof, and the stone foundation had been laid with the precision of a master mason. A covered porch ran along the front of the building, furnished with handmade chairs and a table that invited long conversations and peaceful evenings. Flower boxes beneath the windows contained herbs and wildflowers that added color and life to the rustic setting. "The cabin has 2 rooms, Swift Bear explained as he helped them dismount. "You and the children can have the back room, which has a good fireplace and windows that catch the morning sun. I'll sleep in the tipi, which is more comfortable for me anyway during warm weather." He gestured toward a smaller building that stood apart from the main cabin. That's the root cellar and storage house where I keep food and supplies. There's a smokehouse behind it, and the privy is over there near the trees." Thomas had slid down from the horse and was now exploring the immediate area with the fearless curiosity of childhood, his earlier trauma temporarily forgotten in the excitement of new surroundings. He had discovered a family of chipmunks near the woodpile and was watching them with fascination, his small face bright with wonder. Baby Sarah had awakened during the descent and was looking around with the wide-eyed attention of an infant trying to process new sights and sounds. "There's a well with good water," Swift Bear continued, pointing to a stone-lined circle near the cabin door, "and I keep milk from the goats that graze in the upper meadow. If you're comfortable with such arrangements, we can discuss what comes next after you've had time to rest and recover from your journey." The phrase "what comes next" hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither was quite ready to address directly. Maggie understood that she was being given time to adjust to her new circumstances, without pressure to make immediate decisions about her future. But she also knew that such generosity could not continue indefinitely. At some point, she would need to find a way to support herself and her children, to become self-sufficient, rather than dependent on the charity of others. "Mr. Swift Bear," she began, then stopped, unsure of how to address him properly or what title would be appropriate. He seemed to understand her dilemma and smiled reassuringly. "Just Swift Bear," he said. "Or if that feels too informal, you could call me John, which is the name the missionaries gave me. But Swift Bear is the name my mother chose, and it's the one I prefer." He paused, then added, "And you should know that what I offered in town wasn't charity, exactly. I have genuine need for help with certain aspects of maintaining this place, and a woman with your obvious capabilities could be valuable in ways that go beyond simple housekeeping." The words were carefully chosen, designed to preserve her dignity, while making it clear that any arrangement between them would be one of mutual benefit rather than one-sided dependence. Maggie felt a rush of gratitude that went beyond mere thanks for shelter and protection. This man was offering her a chance to maintain her self-respect while finding her footing in an impossible situation. "I would be grateful for the opportunity to contribute," she replied, matching his formal tone. "I'm a hard worker, and I learn quickly. Whatever needs to be done, I'm willing to do my share and more." As the last light faded from the western sky, Swift Bear built a fire in the stone circle near the cabin door and began preparing a simple meal from supplies he kept in the storage house. Maggie watched him work, noting the efficient way he moved, the obvious familiarity with cooking and domestic tasks that suggested long years of solitary living. When she offered to help, he accepted gratefully, and they worked together in comfortable silence to prepare food for themselves and the children. Thomas fell asleep before the meal was finished, exhausted by the emotional trauma of the day and the excitement of new surroundings. Swift Bear carried the boy into the cabin as if he weighed nothing, settling him on a soft bed made up with blankets and furs that smelled of pine smoke and mountain air. Baby Sarah nursed contentedly in her mother's arms, then dozed off with the peaceful satisfaction of an infant whose needs had been met. When they returned to the fire, Swift Bear and Maggie sat in the growing darkness, each lost in their own thoughts. The night sounds of the mountains surrounded them, the hoot of an owl, the distant howl of a coyote, the rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush. Above them, stars began to appear in numbers that seemed impossible after years of living in towns where smoke and dust obscured the night sky. "I need you to understand," Maggie said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between them, "that I have nothing to offer you in return for this kindness. No money, no possessions of value, no connections that might benefit you in the future. If you're expecting something from me that I'm not able or willing to give, it would be better to say so now, before my children become more attached to this place." Swift Bear was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames as if they might provide answers to questions he hadn't yet learned how to ask. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful, measured, carrying the weight of careful consideration. "Mrs. Sinclair," he said, "I'm 32 years old, and I've been living alone in these mountains for most of the last decade. I chose this life because it seemed preferable to the alternatives available to someone like me, someone who belongs fully to neither world, but is expected to be grateful for scraps of acceptance from both. I've built a good life here, a productive life, but it's a lonely one. When I saw what was happening to you in town today, I recognized something of my own experience in your situation." He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "What I'm offering you is sanctuary, time to heal and plan, and the opportunity to build something better for yourself and your children. What I'm hoping for in return is companionship, conversation, and perhaps the chance to remember what it feels like to be part of a family, even if it's not a traditional one. If that seems like a fair exchange to you, then we can see where this arrangement leads us. If not, I'll help you find other options that better suit your needs." The honesty in his words moved Maggie deeply, and she found herself studying his profile in the firelight, trying to understand this man who had appeared in her life like an answer to prayers she hadn't known how to voice. There was loneliness in his admission, but also strength, and a kind of hope that seemed to mirror her own desperate need for a fresh start. "It seems more than fair," she replied softly. "It seems like a gift I never expected to receive." And as the fire burned down to embers, and the mountain night settled around them like a protective blanket, both Maggie and Swift Bear began to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, they had found something worth building on in this unexpected partnership born of desperation and defended by courage. The first week at Swift Bear's mountain sanctuary passed like a fever dream, each day blending into the next as Maggie struggled to adjust to a way of life she had never imagined possible. She woke each morning to the sound of the stream rushing over smooth stones, and the call of birds she couldn't name, replacing the familiar sounds of town life that had marked her days for years. The cabin's back room had become a refuge where she and her children could heal from the trauma of their public humiliation, but it was also a constant reminder of how completely her life had changed in the span of a single afternoon. Swift Bear moved through his daily routines with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to solitude, but Maggie began to notice the subtle ways he adjusted his habits to accommodate their presence. He rose earlier than usual to tend the animals before Thomas was awake, ensuring the boy wouldn't be startled by unexpected activity. He kept his voice low when moving around the cabin in the early morning hours, mindful that baby Sarah was a light sleeper who needed her rest. Most telling of all, he had begun preparing larger quantities of food without comment or fanfare, simply ensuring that there was always enough for everyone without drawing attention to the additional expense. On the third morning, Maggie woke to find Swift Bear teaching Thomas how to gather eggs from the small flock of chickens that scratched and pecked in a fenced area behind the cabin. The sight of her son's face, bright with concentration and pride as he carefully cradled each egg in his small hands, brought tears to her eyes. It had been months since she had seen Thomas smile with genuine joy, months since he had been allowed to simply be a curious 4-year-old boy exploring the world around him. "Mama, look," Thomas called when he spotted her in the doorway. "Swift Bear says the red hen is the smartest one, and she always hides her eggs in the same corner, but you have to be gentle or she gets angry and won't lay anymore." He held up a brown egg with the reverence of a child displaying a precious treasure. "He says I can help every morning if I remember to move slowly and speak quietly." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Maggie replied, her voice thick with emotion. She tried to hide. "You're becoming quite the farmer." She caught Swift Bear's eye over Thomas's head and mouthed a silent thank you. That made him duck his head with something that might have been embarrassment. The daily routines of mountain life began to reveal the depth of Swift Bear's knowledge and the impressive scope of his self-sufficiency. He maintained extensive gardens that provided vegetables, herbs, and medicinal plants, rotating crops with the precision of someone who understood that a single failed harvest could mean the difference between comfort and starvation. His small herd of goats provided milk and cheese, while the chickens supplied eggs and occasional meat. He hunted and fished with the skill of someone born to such pursuits, but also preserved food with techniques that combined traditional Indian methods with innovations he had learned from various sources. "Where did you learn all of this?" Maggie asked one afternoon as she watched him repair a section of fence that had been damaged by a fallen tree. His movements were precise and economical, wasting neither time nor materials, and the finished work showed the kind of craftsmanship that would last for decades. Swift Bear paused in his work, considering the question with the thoughtfulness she had learned to expect from him. "Many places," he said finally. "My mother's people taught me to read the land, to understand weather patterns and animal behavior, to find food and medicine in the wilderness. The missionary school taught me carpentry and farming techniques, though they disapproved of my interest in what they called heathen practices, and the years I spent working for various ranchers and trading posts taught me how to deal with white men's business and white men's money." There was no bitterness in his voice as he recounted this diverse education, but Maggie sensed the careful control that kept deeper emotions in check. She was beginning to understand that Swift Bear's calm demeanor masked experiences that would have broken lesser men, and that his apparent serenity was actually a form of armor developed through necessity rather than nature. As the days passed, Maggie found herself taking on more responsibilities around the homestead, driven partly by a desire to contribute and partly by the need to feel useful after months of helpless dependency. She discovered that the domestic skills she had learned as a wife and mother translated well to frontier life, though the scale and complexity were far greater than anything she had previously managed. The garden needed constant attention, the animals required daily care, and the endless tasks of food preservation, clothing repair, and household maintenance demanded skills she was still learning. Swift Bear proved to be a patient teacher, offering guidance without condescension and accepting her mistakes as natural parts of the learning process. When she accidentally let the fire under the soap kettle burn too hot, ruining an entire batch of lye soap that represented hours of work, he simply helped her clean up the mess and showed her how to adjust the temperature properly the next time. When she misjudged the timing for harvesting squash and lost several to early frost, he explained the subtle signs that indicated ripeness and helped her preserve what could still be saved. "You learn quickly," he observed one evening as they worked together to prepare vegetables for drying. "And you're not afraid of hard work. Those are valuable qualities in this kind of life." The compliment warmed Maggie more than she cared to admit, partly because it came from someone whose opinion she had grown to value, and partly because it represented the first time in months that anyone had acknowledged her capabilities rather than focusing on her failures and limitations. In Harrison Caldwell's letters, she had been valued primarily as a solution to his loneliness, a warm body to fill an empty house and provide services he couldn't purchase elsewhere. But Swift Bear seemed to see her as a complete person, someone with intelligence, skills, and potential beyond her ability to cook meals and bear children. The transformation in Thomas during these first weeks was nothing short of remarkable. The frightened, withdrawn child who had clung to his mother's skirts in Mesquite Flats began to emerge from his shell like a flower opening to sunlight. He followed Swift Bear around the homestead with the devoted attention of a puppy, absorbing lessons about animal care, weather prediction, and basic survival skills with the hungry enthusiasm of a mind starved for positive attention. Swift Bear, for his part, seemed to take genuine pleasure in the boy's company, answering endless questions with patience and encouraging Thomas's natural curiosity about the world around him. He taught the child to identify different bird calls, to read the signs that indicated changes in weather, and to move through the forest quietly enough to observe wildlife without disturbing it. Most importantly, he treated Thomas with the respect due to a fellow human being, never talking down to him or dismissing his questions as unimportant. "Why don't you live in town like other people?" Thomas asked one afternoon as they worked together to repair a section of chicken coop fence. It was the kind of direct question that children specialized in, cutting straight to the heart of complex issues without regard for social niceties or adult discomfort. Swift Bear was quiet for a moment, his hands never pausing in their work as he considered how to answer honestly without burdening a child with adult complications. "People in town have different ideas about how life should be lived," he said finally. "They think there's only one right way to do things, and if you're different from them, they assume you must be wrong. Up here, I can live according to my own understanding of what's right, without having to argue about it every day." Thomas nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense to him, and Maggie felt her heart clench at the realization that her son was already learning to understand the concept of belonging and not belonging, of being judged by others based on circumstances beyond his control. But there was also something hopeful in the easy way Thomas accepted Swift Bear's explanation, suggesting that perhaps children were naturally more tolerant of differences than the adults who tried to shape their thinking. Baby Sarah, now 9 months old and beginning to show interest in crawling and exploring, had taken to Swift Bear with the trusting acceptance that very young children showed toward people who treated them with kindness. She would reach for him with chubby arms when he entered the cabin, babbling happily in her own mysterious language as if sharing important secrets. Swift Bear responded to her attention with the gentle seriousness that marked all his interactions with the children, talking to her as if she understood every word and treating her infant communications as worthy of careful consideration. "She has her father's eyes," Swift Bear observed one evening as he helped Maggie prepare the children for bed. Sarah was sitting on his lap, playing with the silver ornaments braided into his hair while making the soft gurgling sounds that indicated contentment. And her mother's determination. "She'll be a force to reckon with when she's older." The casual reference to her late husband brought a pang of grief that Maggie had learned to expect but never quite grew accustomed to experiencing. James had been dead for over a year, killed in a mining accident that left her with 2 small children and debts that consumed everything they had saved. But somehow, in the peaceful atmosphere of Swift Bear's mountain home, she found she could think of James with gratitude for the love they had shared, rather than drowning in sorrow for the future they would never have. "He would have liked you," she said softly, surprised by her own words. James always said that a man's character could be judged by how he treated children and animals. "You would have passed his test with honors." Swift Bear's response was so quiet she almost missed it. "I hope I would have been worthy of his trust." The simple sincerity of the statement, delivered without drama or obvious emotion, affected Maggie more powerfully than any elaborate declaration could have. In that moment, she realized that what was growing between them was not the desperate gratitude of a woman with no other options, but genuine respect and affection based on daily evidence of Swift Bear's character and kindness. As the first week stretched into the second, Maggie began to understand that she was not merely a temporary guest in Swift Bear's home, but a participant in a delicate dance of mutual assessment and gradual trust building. Neither of them spoke directly about the future or made assumptions about what their arrangement might become, but both were clearly observing and evaluating, looking for signs that this unlikely partnership might develop into something more permanent and meaningful. The test came unexpectedly, as such tests usually do, when Thomas developed a fever that left him listless and burning with heat that no amount of cool cloths could seem to reduce. Maggie had nursed sick children before, but always with access to a doctor or at least a neighbor woman with more experience than her own. Here in the mountains, miles from the nearest settlement, she found herself facing a mother's worst nightmare with only her own limited knowledge and Swift Bear's mysterious store of healing wisdom to rely upon. Swift Bear took charge of the situation. With calm efficiency that masked what Maggie later realized must have been genuine concern. He prepared herbal teas from plants gathered in the surrounding forest, applied poultices that drew the heat from Thomas's fevered skin, and maintained a vigil beside the child's bed that lasted 3 days and nights. When Maggie tried to relieve him so he could rest, he quietly refused, explaining that the fever would break or worsen during the next 24 hours, and he wanted to be present for whichever occurred. "Where did you learn about healing?" Maggie asked as she watched him prepare another dose of the bitter-tasting tea that seemed to ease Thomas's breathing. "My mother was a medicine woman among her people," Swift Bear replied without looking up from his work. "She taught me to read the signs that plants and bodies give when they're in distress, and how to respond with remedies that work with natural healing rather than against it. The missionary doctors called it superstition, but they couldn't argue with the results." Thomas's fever broke on the 3rd night, his skin cooling and his breathing returning to normal as dawn light began to filter through the cabin windows. Swift Bear, who had dozed fitfully in a chair beside the bed, woke instantly when the child stirred and called for water. The relief on his face as he felt Thomas's cool forehead was unmistakable, and Maggie realized that this man had been prepared to fight death itself to protect her son. "He's going to be fine," Swift Bear said quietly, his voice rough with exhaustion and emotion. The fever was his body's way of fighting off whatever was making him sick. Now he just needs rest and good food to build his strength back up. Maggie found herself crying then, not from grief or fear, but from overwhelming gratitude for this man who had appeared in her life, like an answer to prayers she hadn't known how to voice. Swift Bear had risked his own health to nurse her child through a dangerous illness, had shared knowledge that could have been kept as leverage or payment for her presence in his home, and had shown more genuine care for Thomas's welfare than the boy's own intended stepfather had demonstrated in months of correspondence. "Thank you," she whispered, the words carrying weight far beyond their simple syllables. "I don't know how to repay such kindness." Swift Bear's smile was gentle, tired, and completely without expectation of compensation. Watching him recover. "Is payment enough?" he said. "Children are the future, Mrs. Sinclair. Protecting them is every adult's responsibility, regardless of blood or legal obligations." And in that moment, as dawn broke over the mountain valley and her son slept peacefully for the first time in days, Maggie began to understand that she had found something she had stopped believing existed. A good man whose actions matched his words, whose strength served others rather than himself, and whose presence in her life felt less like charity and more like coming home. 3 weeks had passed since Thomas's fever broke, and the mountain homestead had settled into rhythms that felt as natural as breathing. The autumn air carried the crisp promise of winter, painting the aspen leaves in shades of gold that caught fire in the late afternoon sun. Maggie stood in the cabin doorway, watching Swift Bear and Thomas work together to split wood for the winter stores. Their movements synchronized like a dance. They had been practicing for years rather than mere weeks. Thomas had appointed himself Swift Bear's official assistant, a role that involved mostly holding tools and asking endless questions. But Swift Bear treated the boy's contributions with the seriousness due to a full partner in the enterprise. When Thomas suggested they stack the split logs differently to catch more sun for drying, Swift Bear considered the proposal carefully before implementing it with genuine appreciation for the child's insight. "Your son has an engineer's mind," Swift Bear told Maggie that evening as they prepared supper together in the cabin's main room. "He sees how things work, how they could work better. That's a valuable gift in any world." He paused in his chopping of vegetables, his knife suspended above the cutting board. "He asks me about his father sometimes, about what kind of man he was, whether he would approve of the life we're building here." The words touched something deep in Maggie's chest, a bittersweet recognition of her son's need for masculine guidance and approval. James had been gone so long that Thomas's memories of him were fragmentary, more feeling than fact, but the boy's hunger for a father's presence was evident in the way he shadowed Swift Bear's every movement. "What do you tell him?" Maggie asked, settling baby Sarah in the wooden high chair that Swift Bear had crafted with his own hands. The workmanship was beautiful, every joint smooth and secure, every edge carefully sanded to prevent splinters. Like everything else Swift Bear created, it was built to last generations. "I tell him that his father must have been a good man to have earned the love of such a fine woman, and to have helped create such remarkable children," Swift Bear replied without looking up from his work. "I tell him that the best way to honor his father's memory is to grow up strong and kind and useful to the world around him." The simple honesty of the response brought tears to Maggie's eyes, but they were good tears, cleansing rather than sorrowful. Swift Bear had found a way to honor James's place in their family while creating space for new relationships to grow, and his generosity in doing so revealed depths of character that left her breathless with gratitude and something warmer, something that felt dangerously close to love. That evening, after the children were asleep and the cabin had settled into the peaceful quiet of mountain nights, Maggie and Swift Bear found themselves sitting together on the front porch, sharing the comfortable silence that had become their custom. The stars above seemed close enough to touch, while the sound of the stream provided a constant murmur of contentment that matched the mood settling between them. "I've been thinking about winter," Swift Bear said finally, his voice soft enough not to disturb the night's tranquility. "About what arrangements would work best for everyone when the snows come and travel becomes difficult." He turned to look at her, his expression serious but not unkind. "The cabin will be warmer if we close off the back room and all sleep in the main area. I can string blankets for privacy, but we'll need to share heat to conserve firewood." The practical necessity of his suggestion was obvious, but Maggie understood the deeper implications of what he was proposing. Spending the winter in such close quarters would either strengthen the bonds growing between them or reveal incompatibilities that would make their arrangement untenable. There would be no privacy, no escape from daily irritations, no way to maintain polite distance when tempers frayed or patience wore thin. "That makes sense," she replied, though her heart beat faster at the thought of such intimate proximity. "We'll need to establish clear boundaries, rules that protect everyone's comfort and dignity." She hesitated, then added, "I want you to know that I don't expect anything from this arrangement beyond what you've already given us. Shelter, protection, kindness. You don't owe us anything more, and I don't want you to feel pressured by circumstances or obligation." Swift Bear was quiet for a long moment, his attention apparently focused on the distant mountains that loomed like sleeping giants against the star-filled sky. When he spoke, his words were measured, careful, carrying the weight of thoughts that had been developing over weeks of shared labor and growing intimacy. "Mrs. Sinclair," he said, then stopped and started again. "Maggie, when I was a boy at the mission school, they taught us that marriage was a sacred institution ordained by God for the protection of women and children and the continuation of the species. They had very specific ideas about how such arrangements should be conducted, what roles each partner should play, what obligations and privileges belong to each party." He shifted in his chair, leaning forward with his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. "What they never taught us was how to recognize when two people complement each other so naturally that formal arrangements seem almost beside the point. They never explained how to handle situations where practical partnership grows into something deeper without either party planning or expecting such development." Maggie's breath caught in her throat as she began to understand the direction of his thoughts. "What are you saying?" she asked, though part of her already knew and was terrified by the implications. "I'm saying that what we've built here in these past weeks feels more like a real marriage than most legal arrangements ever achieve. Swift Bear replied, his voice gaining strength as he committed to honesty. We work together, plan together, care for each other's welfare without keeping score or demanding reciprocal benefits. You've made this place feel like a home instead of just a shelter, and I've started thinking about the future in terms of we instead of I, without even realizing. When the change occurred, the admission hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed, beautiful and terrifying in its implications. Maggie felt her heart racing as she contemplated the vast difference between this gentle confession and the crude propositions she had endured from other men. Swift Bear was offering her partnership based on demonstrated compatibility rather than demanding submission based on her desperation. The children love you, she said softly, testing the waters of this new conversation. Thomas follows you around like you're his personal hero, and Sarah lights up every time she sees you. They've never had a father figure who treated them with such respect and patience. And I love them, Swift Bear replied without hesitation. Thomas has the kind of curiosity and courage that could take him anywhere in the world, and Sarah has a spirit that no amount of hardship will ever break. They're remarkable children, and watching them grow and learn has been one of the greatest privileges of my life. The words were simple, direct, free of the elaborate protestations and flowery declarations that had characterized Harrison Caldwell's false courtship. But their very simplicity gave them power that no amount of poetic language could have matched. Swift Bear was offering to be a father to her children, not because law or custom demanded it, but because he had grown to love them as individuals worthy of his devotion. What about us? Maggie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What about what's growing between us that has nothing to do with the children or practical arrangements? Swift Bear's smile was gentle, understanding, free of the assumption and entitlement that had marked her interactions with other men. What's growing between us feels like the kind of love that builds slowly, based on daily evidence of character and compatibility rather than sudden passion that burns hot and dies quickly, he said. It feels like something worth nurturing, worth protecting, worth building a future around. He reached for her hand, his touch warm and sure but still respectful, still seeking permission rather than taking what he wanted. I'm not asking you to make any commitments tonight, Maggie. I'm just telling you how I feel, what I hope might be possible if you feel the same way. We could marry properly when the circuit preacher comes through in spring, make it legal and official if that matters to you. Or we could simply continue as we are, letting our relationship develop naturally without outside interference or judgment. Maggie looked down at their joined hands, marveling at how right it felt to have her fingers entwined with his, how natural and comfortable such intimacy had become without her even noticing the progression. I stopped believing in love, she admitted. After James died, after all the disappointments and false promises, I thought I was done with hoping for anything beyond mere survival. And now? Swift Bear asked gently. Now I think maybe love isn't always what the poets write about, she replied, meeting his eyes with growing confidence. Maybe sometimes it's quieter than that, steadier. Maybe sometimes it's about finding someone who makes you feel safe enough to hope again, strong enough to believe in better tomorrows. Swift Bear's answer was a kiss, gentle and unhurried, full of promise rather than demand. When they broke apart, both were smiling with the kind of quiet joy that comes from recognizing something precious and unexpected. So we'll see what winter brings, Maggie said, her hand still warm in his. We'll see what winter brings, Swift Bear agreed. Together, above them, the stars wheeled through their ancient patterns, while the mountain stream sang its endless song of continuity and change. In the cabin behind them, two children slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they were loved and protected. And on the porch, two adults who had found each other through heartbreak and chance began to plan a future that neither had dared to imagine just weeks before. Winter was coming, but they would face it together, and that made all the difference. In the world, December arrived early that year, bringing with it snowfalls that turned the mountain valley into a crystalline wonderland, and temperatures that made the cabin's warmth feel like a precious gift. True to his word, Swift Bear had restructured the living space, closing off the back room and arranging the main area to accommodate all 4 residents with ingenious space-saving solutions that spoke of careful planning and consideration for everyone's needs. Blanket curtains provided privacy when necessary, while shared body heat kept the entire space comfortably warm even during the coldest nights. The arrangement worked better than Maggie had dared hope. Thomas thrived on the increased closeness, chattering happily to Swift Bear about his dreams and discoveries until sleep claimed him each night. Baby Sarah, now walking with the determined unsteadiness of a child discovering her own mobility, treated the reorganized space like her personal kingdom, toddling between the adults with the confidence of someone who knew herself to be beloved and protected. For Maggie and Swift Bear, the enforced intimacy had deepened their connection in ways that surprised them both. Morning conversations over coffee became treasured rituals, while evening planning sessions evolved into discussions of hopes, dreams, and shared visions for the future. They had settled into the rhythm of an established couple, reading each other's moods and needs with the intuitive understanding that usually took years to develop. It was Thomas who brought news of the approaching threat, racing into the cabin on a crisp morning in mid-December with his cheeks flushed from cold and his eyes bright with excitement that would have been alarming if Maggie had recognized its significance. "Swift Bear, Swift Bear," the boy called, tugging at the man's sleeve with urgent enthusiasm. "There are men on horses coming up the trail. 3 of them, and they have guns and badges that shine in the sun." The effect of these words on Swift Bear was immediate and dramatic. His entire body went rigid, his face assuming the carefully neutral expression that Maggie had learned to recognize as his response to potential danger. He moved to the window with controlled haste, peering through the frost-etched glass toward the trail that wound up from the valley below. "Get the children away from the windows," he said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "Keep them calm, but be ready to take them to the root cellar if I give the signal. There's a hidden passage that leads to the back of the property, and provisions stored there that could sustain you for several days if necessary." Maggie felt her blood turn to ice water as the implications of his words sank in. "Who are they? What do they want?" Swift Bear's jaw tightened as he continued watching the approaching riders. "If I had to guess, I'd say they're bounty hunters or federal marshals looking to collect on old warrants. There are always men willing to make money by dragging Indians back to reservations or territorial courts, especially when winter makes honest work scarce." He turned from the window, his dark eyes meeting hers with grim determination. "There's something I should have told you before now, something about my past that might put all of you in danger." The confession hung between them like a loaded weapon, and Maggie felt the solid foundation of their new life begin to crack beneath her feet. "What kind of danger?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. 10 years ago, I was accused of stealing horses from a cavalry patrol," Swift Bear said, his words coming fast and precise, as if he were reciting facts rather than confessing potentially damning secrets. "I was innocent, but the commanding officer needed someone to blame for his own incompetence, and a half-breed with no political connections made a convenient scapegoat. I escaped from the stockade before my trial and came here to build a new life, but technically I'm still a fugitive from military justice." The sound of hoofbeats was growing louder, accompanied by the jingle of harness, and the low murmur of male voices discussing something with the intensity of predators planning a hunt. Maggie gathered Sarah in her arms while Thomas pressed against her side, his earlier excitement transformed into fear as he sensed the adult's tension. "The warrant probably carries a substantial reward," Swift Bear continued, checking the loads in a rifle that Maggie hadn't known he possessed. Enough to make it worth their while to track me down even in winter conditions. If they take me, you and the children should have enough supplies to last until spring, when you can make your way back to civilization." "No," Maggie said the word, erupting from her with surprising force. "We're not letting them take you. Not after everything we've built here, everything we've become. There has to be another way." Swift Bear's smile was sad but grateful, touched with amazement that anyone would risk danger to protect him. "Maggie, these men won't hesitate to use violence if they think you're harboring a fugitive. Your children need their mother more than I need defending. Promise me you'll think of them first, no matter what happens." Before Maggie could respond, a harsh voice called out from the yard outside, carrying the unmistakable tone of official authority, backed by weapons and legal sanction. "Swift Bear, we know you're in there. This is Deputy Marshal Garrett with federal warrants for your arrest. Come out with your hands visible and no one needs to get hurt." Through the window, Maggie could see 3 men on horseback, their breath steaming in the cold air as they positioned themselves strategically around the cabin. All were armed with rifles and pistols, and their faces carried the hard confidence of men accustomed to getting what they wanted through intimidation and superior firepower. The leader, presumably Marshal Garrett, was a heavy-set man with gray whiskers and eyes like chips of ice, while his companions had the lean, dangerous look of professional manhunters. "We've got the place surrounded," Garrett continued, his voice carrying clearly through the thin mountain air. "And we know there's a woman and children in there with you. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Come out peaceful, and they won't be harmed." Swift Bear's hands were steady as he checked his ammunition, but Maggie could see the pain in his eyes as he contemplated the destruction of everything they had built together. "I have to go out there," he said quietly. "If I resist, they might decide you're accomplices. At least if I surrender voluntarily, you'll be safe." "Wait," Maggie said, her mind racing as she tried to find some alternative to the disaster bearing down on them. "What if we could prove your innocence? What if there was evidence that you weren't guilty of the charges?" Swift Bear shook his head sadly. "After 10 years? Even if such evidence existed, which it doesn't, these men didn't come here to conduct a trial. They came to collect a bounty, and my guilt or innocence is irrelevant to their purposes." The truth of his words was devastating, but it also sparked something fierce and protective in Maggie's chest. This man who had saved her and her children from disaster, who had shown them kindness and love when the rest of the world offered only judgment and rejection, was about to be destroyed by the same system that had allowed Harrison Caldwell to humiliate her in public without consequence. "Swift Bear." Marshal Garrett's voice was growing impatient. "You've got 1 minute to come out before we come in after you. And I guarantee you won't like our methods if we have to drag you out." It was then that inspiration struck, born of desperation and fueled by the kind of courage that only emerges when everything precious is threatened with destruction. Maggie thrust Sarah into Swift Bear's arms and moved toward the cabin door with determined strides. "What are you doing?" Swift Bear demanded, alarmed by the sudden change in her demeanor. "Something that should have been done years ago," Maggie replied, her voice carrying a strength she hadn't known she possessed. "I'm going to tell them the truth about who you really are, and what kind of man would steal you away from the people who need you." Before Swift Bear could stop her, Maggie pulled open the cabin door and stepped out into the bitter cold, her chin raised defiantly as she faced the 3 armed men who had come to destroy her family. The wind whipped her skirts around her legs and stung her cheeks with ice crystals, but her voice carried clearly across the snowy yard. "Marshal Garrett," she called, her tone formal and respectful but unyielding. "I am Mrs. Magnolia Sinclair, and the man you're seeking is my husband and the father of my children. Before you take him away to satisfy some decade-old warrant, I think you should know exactly what kind of criminal you're so eager to arrest." The marshal's expression shifted. from confident authority to wary confusion as he tried to process this unexpected development. Behind Maggie, she could hear Swiftbear's sharp intake of breath, could sense his amazement at her willingness to publicly claim him as her husband, despite the potential consequences. "Ma'am," Marshal Garrett said carefully, "I don't know what. This man has told you about his situation, but he's a wanted fugitive who's been evading federal justice for 10 years. Whatever lies he's fed you about his character, the fact remains that he's a horse thief and a deserter." "The fact," Maggie replied, her voice gaining strength with each word, "is that this man saved my children and me from destitution and despair, built us a home with his own hands, and showed us more genuine Christian charity than all the so-called respectable citizens of Mesquite Flats combined. If that's the behavior of a criminal, then perhaps you should be arresting the wrong people." The marshal's face darkened at the implied criticism, but before he could respond, the sound of additional hoofbeats echoed across the valley, and all eyes turned toward the trail to see who else was approaching this remote confrontation that would determine the fate of everything Maggie had grown to love. The approaching riders materialized through the swirling snow like figures from a fever dream, their horses breathing clouds of vapor as they climbed the final stretch of trail toward Swiftbear's homestead. Marshal Garrett's hand instinctively moved to his weapon as he tried to identify the newcomers, his confidence wavering as he realized his carefully planned arrest was about to become more complicated than anticipated. The lead rider was an elderly man with silver hair and a bearing that spoke of natural authority, while his two companions wore the practical clothing of working ranchers rather than the official garb of law enforcement. As they drew closer, Maggie felt her heart skip with recognition and desperate hope. The silver-haired man was Judge William Thornfield, the territorial circuit judge whose reputation for fairness had made him a legend throughout the mountain territories. "Marshal Garrett," Judge Thornfield called as he dismounted with the careful movements of a man whose joints had been stiffened by decades of hard riding and harsh weather. "I received word that you were planning to execute an arrest warrant in my jurisdiction. I thought it best to observe the proceedings personally, given the unusual circumstances surrounding this particular case." Garrett's face cycled through several expressions as he tried to process this unexpected development. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward fugitive apprehension. The suspect has been evading federal custody for 10 years, and we have properly executed warrants for his arrest." Judge Thornfield nodded thoughtfully, but his keen eyes were already taking in the domestic scene before him, the well-maintained homestead, the obvious signs of a stable family life, the protective way Maggie positioned herself between the armed men and the cabin where her children waited. "Indeed, Marshal. However, I've recently had occasion to review the original case files, and I found several irregularities that warrant investigation." The judge's words sent a shock through the assembled group, but none more so than Swiftbear, who had emerged from the cabin to stand beside Maggie with baby Sarah in his arms and Thomas clinging to his leg. For the first time since the confrontation began, hope flickered in his dark eyes. "What kind of irregularities?" Swiftbear asked, his voice carefully controlled despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Judge Thornfield reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a leather portfolio thick with official documents. "It seems that Colonel Marcus Henley, the officer who filed the original charges against you, was court-martialed 3 years ago for systematic theft of government property, including horses, supplies, and payroll funds. During his trial, he confessed to framing several innocent men to cover his own crimes, though he died before providing a complete list of his victims." The revelation hit the gathered men like a physical blow. Marshal Garrett's face went pale as he began to understand the implications, while his two companions shifted nervously in their saddles, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the situation was taking. "Furthermore," Judge Thornfield continued, his voice carrying the authority of absolute legal certainty, "I have sworn statements from 3 surviving members of that cavalry patrol, testifying that you attempted to prevent the theft of those horses, not commit it. They were too frightened of retribution to speak up at the time, but Colonel Henley's death freed them to tell the truth at last. Swift Bear's knees nearly buckled with relief, and Maggie reached out to steady him, her own tears flowing freely as the weight of 10 years' fear and uncertainty lifted from their shoulders. Thomas looked up at the adults around him with confusion, not understanding the legal complexities, but sensing that something wonderful was happening. "Your Honor," Marshal Garrett said, his voice tight with embarrassment and growing anger. "We acted in good faith based on properly issued federal warrants. If there were problems with the original charges, that's not our responsibility." "No," Judge Thornfield agreed, "but continuing to pursue an innocent man after being presented with evidence of his innocence would be a serious violation of your oath as a federal officer. I trust you'll withdraw your warrants and report this development to your superiors immediately." The marshal's face darkened with frustrated rage, but he was trapped by the weight of legal authority and the presence of witnesses who could testify to his conduct. "Fine," he spat, wheeling his horse toward the trail. "But don't expect the government to compensate him for his troubles. Innocent or not, he chose to run instead of fighting the charges in court." "Actually," Judge Thornfield said with a hint of a smile, "territorial law provides for substantial compensation in cases of wrongful prosecution, especially when the victim can demonstrate ongoing harm to his reputation and livelihood. I suspect Mr. Swift Bear will find the government quite generous in its desire to avoid further publicity about Colonel Henley's crimes." As the three bounty hunters disappeared down the mountain trail, their frustrated curses echoing off the surrounding peaks, Judge Thornfield turned his attention to the small family that had been unwitting players in this decade-long drama of injustice and redemption. "Mr. Swift Bear," he said formally, "on behalf of the territorial government, I offer you our sincere apologies for the suffering you've endured as a result of one man's corruption and cowardice. Your name has been officially cleared, and you're free to live openly without fear of further legal harassment." Swift Bear nodded his thanks, but it was Maggie who found her voice first. "Your Honor, how did you know to come here? How did you learn about the case files?" Judge Thornfield's weathered face creased in a genuine smile. "A week ago, I received a visit from Sheriff Morrison in Mesquite Flats. It seems that certain events in his town last autumn had caused him to reflect on the nature of justice and character. Judgment. He asked me to investigate the background of a man he described as the most decent fellow he'd ever met. Regardless of what old warrants might say, the revelation that Sheriff Morrison had taken action to help them brought fresh tears to Maggie's eyes. Even in a town that had rejected and humiliated her, there had been one person willing to look beyond surface judgments to recognize true character. "There's one more matter to address," Judge Thornfield continued, his tone becoming ceremonially formal. "Mrs. Sinclair, I understand you and Mr. Swift Bear wish to formalize your union in the eyes of the law. I'm authorized to perform such ceremonies, and it would be my honor to officiate if you're prepared to take that step." Maggie looked at Swift Bear, seeing in his face the same mixture of joy, relief, and overwhelming love that filled her own heart. Thomas tugged at Swift Bear's sleeve, his young voice piping up with perfect timing. "Does this mean you're going to be my real papa now?" he asked with the directness that only children could achieve. Swift Bear knelt down to the boy's level, baby Sarah still secure in one arm, his voice thick with emotion as he answered, "If you'll have me, Thomas. If you think I'd make a good papa for you and Sarah." "The best papa ever," Thomas declared with absolute conviction, throwing his arms around Swift Bear's neck in a fierce hug that spoke volumes about the bond that had grown between them. And so, as snow began to fall again over the mountain valley, Judge Thornfield performed a wedding ceremony that joined not just two hearts, but an entire family that had been forged in hardship and sealed in love. The words were simple, traditional, but they carried the weight of promises made and kept, of trust earned through adversity, and of a future that stretched ahead bright with possibility. When spring came to the mountains, the Sinclair homestead would officially become the Swift Bear Ranch, legally recognized and financially secure thanks to the territorial government's compensation. Thomas would grow up strong and proud, learning the skills of both worlds from a father who understood the value of knowledge over prejudice. Sarah would become a force of nature, beloved and protected, but never limited by others' expectations. And Maggie would wake each morning to the sound of the mountain stream and the quiet breathing of the family she had never dared to dream possible. Secure in the knowledge that love, when built on respect and tested by adversity, could indeed conquer all. In a world that too often judged by appearances and accepted cruelty as normal, they had created something beautiful and lasting, proof that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as disasters, and that the heart that has been broken can become stronger than ever when it learns to love again.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.